I've been driving the same cab for 18 years, and last Tuesday, I realized I'd become a priest. Not the official kind, no collar, no seminary training, just a guy named Frank who owns a beat-up Crown Vic and knows every shortcut in the city. But somewhere along the way, between the airport runs and the bar pickups, my cab had turned into a confessional booth on wheels. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took 18 years of gradual awakening, of slowly learning to see the people in my backseat as more than just fares. In the beginning, I was like most drivers, radio up, meter running, focused on the destination rather than the journey. People were just bodies that needed to get from point A to point B. But years of driving the same streets, picking up the same kinds of broken people at the same desperate hours, started to wear down my indifference. You can't watch human pain night after night without it changing you, even if you're trying not to notice. Somewhere around year 10, I started really listening when passengers talked. Around year 15, I realized I was the only person some of them had spoken to in days. By year 17, I'd learned to recognize the particular silence that comes before someone tells you something important, a hushed reverence that felt almost sacred. The Father Frank nickname only started a few months ago, but it was built on years of small moments, tiny acts of attention that had slowly accumulated into something larger. The businessman was the first one who made me understand what was happening. He climbed into my back seat at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday, still in his wrinkled suit, tie hanging loose like a noose around his neck. I could smell the alcohol on him before he even gave me the address, airport, red-eye flight to Seattle. The crying started before we hit the first traffic light. Not the quiet kind of crying, the ugly, shoulder-shaking sobs that come from somewhere deep and broken. I watched him in the rearview mirror, this middle-aged man falling apart in my back seat, and something in me shifted. Instead of turning up the radio and pretending not to notice, I pulled over. The story poured out of him like water from a broken pipe. 3 years of an affair. A wife who'd known all along but pretended otherwise. A father who died 6 months ago, and a brother in Seattle who still didn't know because this man had been too much of a coward to make the call. Each confession seemed to lighten something in his shoulders, like he was physically transferring the weight of his secrets to the worn fabric of my back seat. When I dropped him at the terminal, he left me a $50 tip and said something that stuck with me, "Thanks, Father Frank." I laughed it off then, but the name followed me. Something about that moment, the weight of his confession lifting from his shoulders, the peace that settled over his face, felt like witnessing a small miracle. Word spread through the city's invisible network of broken people. The dispatcher started getting requests for me specifically, passengers who asked for Father Frank, like I was some kind of urban legend. My boss thought it was hilarious until he realized I was getting more rides than any other driver in the company. The teenage girl came the next week. She got in downtown, mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks, dress torn at the shoulder. She'd been assaulted at a party but was terrified to call the police because the perpetrator was her best friend's boyfriend. The whole social ecosystem of her teenage world would collapse if she spoke up, she explained through hiccuping sobs. I drove her to the hospital first, waiting in the parking lot while she got examined. Then I drove her home, sitting in her driveway while she gathered the courage to walk through her front door. Her parents came running when they saw her condition, and I watched through my windshield as she told them everything. The father's face went through about 6 different emotions in 10 seconds, confusion, fear, rage, protectiveness, and finally, a fierce determination that told me this girl was going to be okay. 3 months later, she got back in my cab. This time, she was dressed for court, carrying a folder of papers that would help convict her attacker. She'd found her voice, and it was stronger than I'd ever heard it. The old man, George, started riding with me every Tuesday. He'd been shoplifting groceries because his Social Security didn't cover both food and his heart medications. Pride had kept him from asking for help, but desperation had finally won. I spent my day off driving him to the food bank, helping him navigate the bureaucracy of assistance programs. Now he volunteers there 3 days a week, helping other seniors who are too proud to ask for help. The college student, Emma, had been living in her car for 2 weeks after getting kicked out of her dorm for unpaid tuition. Her parents had cut her off when she changed her major from business to social work, deciding that helping people wasn't a real career. I drove her to 3 different shelters before we found one with space, then helped her connect with a campus counselor who found her emergency housing funds. Each story became part of my route, part of the invisible map of human need that I navigated every night. I started carrying tissues in my glove compartment, business cards for social services, phone numbers for crisis hotlines. My cab became a mobile resource center for people who'd fallen through the cracks of normal society. Gradually, I began to understand that I was witnessing something profound, not just people sharing problems, but souls seeking absolution. The physical space of my cab had somehow become sacred ground, a place where people could lay down their burdens and find the strength to carry on. The thing about secrets is that they're like physical weight. People carry them in their shoulders, their stomachs, their hearts. They walk differently under that burden, breathe differently. And when they finally set it down, even temporarily, even in the back seat of a stranger's cab, something fundamental shifts. They sit up straighter. They make eye contact in the mirror. They remember how to hope. I started to see these moments as acts of grace, not the religious kind I'd learned about in childhood Sunday school, but something deeper and more universal. The grace that comes when one human being truly listens to another without judgment, when healing happens in the space between confession and acceptance. I started recognizing the signs, the way someone's voice changes when they're about to tell you something important, the particular silence that comes before a confession, the way people's hands move when they're deciding whether to trust you with their truth. I learned to create space for these moments, to drive slower, to take the long way when someone needed more time to find their words. But last Tuesday changed everything. I picked up a woman outside the courthouse, professionally dressed but shaking like a leaf. She was probably 40, with careful makeup that couldn't quite hide the exhaustion in her eyes. She got in and gave me an address in the suburbs, then sat in complete silence for the first 10 minutes of the ride. I watched her in the mirror, recognizing the particular tension of someone carrying something too heavy to hold alone. Finally, she spoke. I just testified against my sister's ex-husband in his murder trial. She paused, then added quietly, "I'm sorry, I'm Maria Lombardi. I should have introduced myself." "Frank," I said. "Frank Cavaliere. And you don't need to apologize for anything." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I pulled over, not because I planned to, but because something in her voice demanded that level of attention. "He killed my sister," she continued, her voice steady but her hands betraying her with their trembling. "Shot her in her kitchen while she was making dinner for her kids. I was the only witness." The story unfolded slowly. She'd been visiting her sister, Linda, when her ex-husband showed up drunk and angry about some perceived slight. They'd been divorced for 2 years, but he'd never stopped seeing Linda as his property, never stopped believing he had the right to control her life. The argument escalated quickly, and when Linda tried to call the police, he pulled out a gun. "I was hiding in the pantry with the kids," she said, staring out the window at the traffic flowing past us. "I watched him kill her through the crack in the door. The kids were crying, but I had to keep them quiet. I had to keep them safe. Everyone kept telling her she was brave for testifying," she explained, "but she didn't feel brave. She felt terrified. The defendant's family had been sending her threatening messages. His lawyer had tried to paint her as an unreliable witness, someone with a grudge against her former brother-in-law. Her sister's children, now orphaned, would grow up knowing their father was a murderer because she couldn't keep quiet. When I asked her what the alternative would have been, she looked at me in the mirror, and I saw something shift in her expression. "Letting him get away with it," she said quietly. But when I pressed whether she could have lived with that choice, the question hung between us for a long moment before she shook her head. No, she couldn't have lived with that silence. I thought about all the people who'd sat in my back seat over the years, all the secrets they'd shared, all the courage they'd found in the safety of temporary confession. I'd witnessed so many moments of grace, people finding the strength to forgive themselves and others, choosing healing over hatred. Brave isn't not being scared, I told her. Brave is being scared and doing the right thing anyway. She cried then, the kind of crying that comes from relief as much as pain. I drove her to her sister's house, where two little boys ran to her like she was their favorite person in the world. She introduced me to them as Frank, who's kind of like a priest but drives a taxi instead of working in a church. The older boy, maybe 7, looked at me with serious eyes. Do you know God? I thought about all the broken people I'd carried, all the confessions I'd heard, all the small miracles I'd witnessed in the back seat of my cab. I think so, kid. He rides in my car sometimes. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the phone. My ex-wife Sarah had been calling for weeks, asking me to come see our daughter graduate from high school. I'd been making excuses, work was busy, I didn't have money for a plane ticket, Jenna probably didn't want me there anyway. All lies. The truth was more complicated and uglier. I'd been a lousy husband and an absent father. I'd chosen the freedom of the road over the responsibility of home, told myself that providing money was the same as providing love. When Sarah finally had enough and filed for divorce, I'd been almost relieved. No more pretending to be someone I wasn't. No more disappointing people I cared about. But sitting there, thinking about all the people who'd found the courage to face their mistakes, to carry their guilt into the light and ask for forgiveness, I felt the weight of my own cowardice. I'd been running from my failures for 10 years, hiding behind the anonymity of my profession, telling myself that helping strangers was enough to balance the scales. But I'd learned from my passengers that true redemption required facing the people you'd hurt most, not just those you could help from a safe distance. I picked up the phone and dialed Sarah's number. She sounded surprised to hear from me, cautious in the way that comes from years of broken promises and missed opportunities. I told her the truth, that I was scared Jenna didn't want me at her graduation, scared I'd say the wrong thing or embarrass her, scared we'd fall back into the old patterns that had destroyed our marriage. Sarah's voice softened as she explained how Jenna had been asking about me, how she'd been watching other kids' fathers show up to school events for years while Sarah made excuses for my absence. This graduation wasn't just any milestone, Jenna was valedictorian, had earned a full scholarship to Northwestern, and despite pretending not to care, she'd been secretly hoping I'd finally show up for the biggest day of her life. Sarah's tone carried a mixture of exhaustion and determination as she made it clear this was my last real chance to be her father before she became an adult and moved beyond my reach. Why now, Frank? She asked quietly. What's really changed? The words came easier than I'd expected as I apologized for being selfish and absent, for making her raise our daughter alone. But I also acknowledged something we'd both been too proud to admit, that we'd both been drowning back then, just in different ways. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried a vulnerability I hadn't heard in years. She admitted she hadn't been easy to live with either, that her constant anger, at me, at herself, at how hard everything had become, had probably pushed me away as much as I'd run. The honesty in her voice made something shift in my chest, a recognition of shared failure rather than individual blame. We were kids trying to play house, I said. Neither of us knew what we were doing. She asks about you, you know, Sarah continued. Jenna. She pretends she doesn't care, but she does. She's been hoping you'd call. I booked a flight that night, my hands shaking as I entered my credit card information. The ticket cost more than I'd made in a week, but for the first time in years, I was spending money on something that mattered more than my own comfort. The next morning, I drove to the airport to pick up one last passenger before catching my own flight. It was a young couple, nervous energy crackling between them as they climbed into the back seat. The woman was breathing through contractions while her husband fumbled with a hospital bag. St. Mary's Hospital, she managed between breaths. Labor and delivery. I drove through the familiar streets of my city, thinking about all the stories I'd collected over the years. All the broken people who'd found their way into my cab, looking for someone to listen, someone to understand, someone to tell them they weren't alone. I'd spent 18 years carrying other people's secrets, helping them find the courage to face their truths. Now it was my turn. At the airport, I handed my keys to Jimmy, another driver who'd agreed to cover my routes for the week. He looked at me strangely. I hadn't taken a vacation in 3 years. "You okay, Frank?" I thought about the question, really thought about it. "I'm going to be." The flight to Denver was turbulent, but I didn't mind. I'd spent so many years moving in straight lines, following the same routes, avoiding the uncertain terrain of emotional risk. A little turbulence felt appropriate. Sarah met me at the airport, and for a moment, we just stood there looking at each other. She was older, obviously, with lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when we were married. But she was still beautiful, still carried herself with the quiet strength that had attracted me 20 years ago. "You came," she said. "I said I would." "You've said that before." I nodded, accepting the truth of it. "I know. But this time is different." She studied my face, looking for the lie she'd learned to expect. When she didn't find it, her expression softened slightly. "Jenna's nervous about seeing you." "I'm nervous about seeing her." "Good. That means you care." The graduation ceremony was held in the high school gymnasium, rows of folding chairs filled with proud parents and restless siblings. I sat in the back, not wanting to presume too much, watching hundreds of teenagers in caps and gowns file across the stage. When they called Jenna's name, I stood up without thinking about it, clapping until my hands hurt. She was beautiful, tall like her mother, with my dark hair and Sarah's determined chin. She'd grown up to be the kind of person who looked the world in the eye and didn't back down. I'd missed all of it, the awkward middle school years, the first heartbreak, the college applications, the late-night conversations about the future. I'd been driving strangers around the city while my own daughter was learning to drive, taking her first job, becoming the person she was meant to be. After the ceremony, Jenna found me in the crowd. She was taller than I'd expected, almost as tall as me, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part curiosity, part wariness, part hope. The simple word, "Dad," hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I deserved to cross. When I managed, "Hey, kiddo," in response, we stood there for a moment with 18 years of distance between us, neither of us sure how to bridge it. Then she hugged me, fierce and quick, and I felt something in my chest crack open. I told her I was proud of her, and her response surprised me. She'd looked me up online after Sarah told her I was coming, she explained. She'd found forum posts about me, people talking about a taxi driver who actually listened to them, who they called Father Frank. She'd searched for Franklin Cavaliere and discovered this whole other side of her father she'd never known existed. She'd wanted to know if I'd really changed, or if this was just another promise I'd break. Her mother had said I sounded different on the phone this time, like I actually meant it. The words hit me like a physical blow, but there was no anger in them, just a kind of sad understanding that told me my daughter had grown up to be more generous than I deserved. When I told her I wanted to try, to be better, to be present, she studied my face with those serious eyes that looked so much like her mother's. Her response was simple but carried the weight of every broken promise I'd ever made. I had to actually do it this time, not just say it. I nodded, understanding that this was my last chance, that she was offering me something precious and fragile that I'd already broken once. That night, Sarah and I sat on her back porch, drinking coffee and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of forgiveness. We talked about Jenna's plans for college, about the scholarship she'd earned, about the young man she'd been dating who made her laugh. But gradually our conversation turned to us, to the people we'd been 20 years ago, to the mistakes we both made, to how much easier it had been to blame each other than to admit we'd simply been too young and too scared to know how to love properly. Sarah observed that Jenna was going to be okay, that she'd raised a good kid despite everything. When I started to protest that she meant, despite me, her smile reached her eyes in a way I remembered from years ago. Maybe it was because of the struggles, she reflected, maybe Jenna had learned what not to do by watching our failures. I thought about that idea, that all those years of carrying other people's stories had been preparing me for this moment, teaching me how to be present for the people who mattered most. Maybe the long way around was the only way I could have gotten here. Maybe I'd needed to learn about grace by witnessing it in others before I could accept it for myself. I found myself telling Sarah that I wanted to move back, not to this house, but to Denver, close enough to have dinner with Jenna once a week, to meet her boyfriends, to be annoying in the way fathers are supposed to be annoying. The idea brought a genuine smile to Sarah's face. She'd like that too, she said, and I realized that forgiveness, when it finally comes, arrives quietly, without fanfare or grand gestures. Flying back to the city felt different this time. I wasn't running from something anymore, I was running toward it. I'd already started making plans in my head, giving my boss notice, finding a buyer for my medallion, looking at apartments in Denver. Jimmy could take over most of my regular passengers, which felt right. They needed someone who could be fully present for their stories, not someone who was already halfway out the door. But before I left, I had one more ride to make. Mrs. Lombardi was waiting outside the courthouse, just like she'd been a week ago. But this time, she was carrying a small suitcase and wearing a smile that transformed her entire face. "He got life without parole," she said as she got into the back seat. "It's over." I drove her to the airport, where she was catching a flight to start a new life in a place where no one knew her story. Her sister's children were coming with her, they'd asked her to adopt them, and she'd said yes. A family born from tragedy, but a family nonetheless. "What are you going to do?" she asked me as I helped her with her luggage. "I'm going to try being a father," I said. "I'm a little out of practice, but I think I remember how." She smiled. "It's like riding a bike. Once you learn, you never really forget." I drove home through the city streets one last time, past all the places where I'd picked up broken people and helped them find their way. The diner where the businessman had called his brother. The hospital where the teenage girl had found her courage. The courthouse where Mrs. Lombardi had faced her demon and won. Tomorrow, I'd start packing. In a month, I'd be in Denver, learning how to be present for the people who needed me most. But tonight, I was still Father Frank, still carrying the weight of other people's secrets, still believing that sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is simply listen. I'd learned that my cab wasn't just transportation, it was a sanctuary where broken souls found their way back to wholeness, one confession at a time. My phone buzzed with a ride request. Someone downtown needed a driver, needed someone to carry them from one place to another, from one version of themselves to the next. I turned on my dispatcher radio and headed toward the city center, ready for one more confession, one more story, one more small miracle in the back seat of a beat-up Crown Vic. After all, 18 years of driving had taught me that the journey is never really over. You just find new routes, new destinations, new ways to help people find their way home.